Hello and welcome to another edition of ChinnyVision. This edition we're looking at Feud from Bulldog software from 1987. Feud was available on lots and lots of different formats, every single popular format of the day: Spectrum, Amstrad, Commodore 64, also ported to the ST, Amiga, Atari 8-bit, PC and MSX as well. The Spectrum version is the version that people tend to remember the most. In Feud, you have to battle your brother, Leonaric, who's controlled by the computer, by collecting ingredients that are spread all over the map. So it's one of those games where you need to map out where everything is, really. There's all sorts of different spells you can cast, from missile spells to protect spells, to even converting villagers that you can pass into zombies. As you can see here, Leonaric is on the screen at the moment, and he's got a missile spell, a fire spell. He's firing it at me, so I've kind of lost some energy there, and you can see the little statues on the bottom of the screen have shrunk down. The Spectrum version is quite good. As I say, it is 48K game, so you've only got the beeper. Graphics are very well defined, only colour clash where you kind of got the usual situations where things cross over in front of you. Very, very good version of the game. Crossing over to the Amstrad, you get a very colourful loading screen, as you can see. Good presentation on the menu. Really, really good theme music in the background, and you get all this kind of drawing going on. Nice Feud logo at the top. Really good presentation here. Lots of colour in the game. As you can see, there's a kind of split mode thing going on here. You've got the CPC's low resolution for the playfield area, but actually the medium 4 colour mode used for the status screen down below. You get the more detailed graphics down below. One of the kind of areas you'll need to go into in Feud is this herb garden, because a lot of the ingredients you'll need are in here. Thing is, the herb garden is guarded by this mad monk who follows you around everywhere, and when you touch him, as you can see, you lose energy. So you've got to be quite careful how you go about getting your ingredients when you're in the herb garden. But it's quite a kind of critical part of the game, because you're going to be picking up a whole load of spells from within here, and then the other half of the kind of spells are going to be out in different parts of the map. Feud was produced by Binary Design for Mastertronic, or Bulldog as it was one of the labels they put it out on. It was designed by John Pickford of the Pickford Brothers, also famous for games like Zub. Quite unusual, because this time he designed the game but didn't program any of the versions, unlike Zub and Glider Rider and other games like that. Steve Pickford did all the graphics on all the different versions. That's quite important when we come to look at some of the other versions later, because the Spectrum and Amstrad version have different graphics, but what's interesting is the Amstrad version appears to have been used as a kind of base for the other versions, and we'll see that a bit later on. So now we go to the cauldron and we mix up all the bits of the spell that we need, that we're going to go off and fire at Leonaric any second. We're going to go off and find him. Right, here he is, and unfortunately he's got a spell in first, so he's hitting me and I'm losing even more energy. So hopefully when he's done here, I'm going to flick over to the right page of my spell book, if I can find it. Then I'm going to fire at him. There I go. Now he's gone wandering off, and unfortunately I haven't got much energy left. So next time we come across each other, I'm going to be dead. Crossing over to the C64, you've got the CPC's loading screen here, and it is the CPC's loading screen. I've checked that with Steve Pickford on Twitter earlier today. It was ported across. So it is identical, and again it goes back to this kind of thing that Binary Design were doing, of porting the graphics and code between systems. So you've got the CPC's loading screen here, and again, nice menu system here, very good presentation, nice tune. But I'm afraid on the C64 it's all downhill from here. So superficially it's all looking good, but moving around at quite a pace here. Unfortunately, the kind of sprite animation here doesn't actually quite match the kind of speed you're going at, which is a bit of a shame, but it's not too critical. It's quite nice to actually have a bit more speed. But unfortunately you can do things like this, kind of scoot along. other than that, it is quite detailed. There's some of the same sprites you're seeing earlier there as well. Unfortunately, that kind of thing happens. Leonaric suddenly goes skating past through other sprites, and you go back and he does it again. There's no sense to what the AI of the computer player is doing. He goes off one side of the screen, and when you go back, he returns again, as if he'd never kind of gone past you, and it's really bizarre. According to the Pickford brothers, this is because on the Commodore 64 version, unlike the other versions, when Leonaric goes off the screen, the game stops tracking him. And this is quite fundamental to the whole game, because in the other versions, the game's playing fair. All the time you're wandering around, the computer player is also wandering around. And yes, there's a few AI glitches in the Amstrad and Spectrum versions, and you're going to follow Leonaric around, and sometimes you might jump a wall or something. But generally speaking, he's always where you expect him to be, and he's not cheating. The computer isn't cheating. In the Commodore 64 version, the computer has got so many shortcuts in the AI that basically the computer's cheating. He just goes off the screen, he returns another way, so he gets spells out of nowhere, and you just end up feeling completely and utterly cheated by the game. And there's also other glitches. You can walk through some of the playfield objects, like this kind of house here, so it's just kind of, it feels unfinished and shoddy, which is such a shame because the Amstrad and Spectrum versions are so good and so polished, and there's been so much attention to detail taken over them. There's no reason why the Commodore 64 version needs to be so bad, because the game's got a good design, it's got good graphics, but the guy who's programmed the Commodore 64 version has just taken a load of shortcuts, and really the game's not finished and not fit to be played really, which is a real shame. So now we're on to the other 6502 version of Feud, the Atari 8-bit, and I'm playing this on my Atari XE. The first thing that strikes you is, again, the graphics have been ported across from probably the Amstrad version, but it's also incredibly brown and grey, and I'm not an Atari expert, but I don't think there's any reason why it needs to be so kind of murky. It's quite a capable system, but there's one really odd thing about the XE version, and in the other versions, Leonaric is wandering around, and you come across him, and he can't do any harm to you unless he's got a spell. But in the XE version, in the Atari version, as soon as you touch him, bang, you're dead. He's miles away from you, and he doesn't have any spells, but you're dead. None of the other versions do that, so I'm a bit of a downer there on the Atari version, because really, the whole point of the game is he's wandering around and he can't kill you unless he's got spells. Now, after the 8-bit versions were done, the initial kind of Commodore 64, CPC and Sinclair versions were done, Binary Design also decided to port the game to the ST and Amiga, which were brand new machines, and I believe the Pickfords have said this is the first time they were kind of working on the 16 bits. And you've got this nicely drawn menu screen by Steve Pickford here. The game has some really nice, far more detailed graphics as you'd expect on the 16-bit versions. And initial impressions are good. We're on the Amiga version here, and there's no music, and there's no reason why the Amiga shouldn't have any music. It's just spot effects, and that's it, and that's a real shame. But the graphics are nice. You're wandering around, you get much more of a sense of kind of a real, not so much a real world, but it's kind of sense of place. One thing I've noticed, I've not played this version quite as much as the 8-bit versions. The map doesn't seem to kind of wrap around like the 8-bit versions do, which is a shame. You kind of go off one side of the map and you end up the other side, which is really kind of useful for wandering around. Can't see that the 16-bit versions do this. I could be wrong, but I can't see it does it. Another thing missing from the 16-bit versions, along with the music, is there's no monk in the herb garden, which is actually quite fundamental as well, because you've got all these kind of ingredients around there, and the point is they're not supposed to be too easy to get at. But without him guarding them there, you just kind of wander in, help yourself, and go off again. And it makes the game far easier, which is a shame. And again, I don't know why he's not there, but it just seems to be a kind of missing feature. Now, very oddly for kind of game of this era, 1987, Feud was actually ported to the IBM PC. Primarily, I expect, intended for the American market. And this one's a really curious case because if you look at this loading screen, it's the CPC loading screen that Steve Pickford drew on the Amstrad, except with some really, really bizarre colours. I don't know why, because it's running in EGA, and EGA is quite capable of, I think it's got 64 colours, and you can use 16 on screen at any time. So there's no reason why this game should have the loading screen with a kind of yellow face and everything else here, but that's the way it is. We've got a kind of basic menu system here, and I must stress that while on this YouTube channel we always try and run original hardware and capture that, on this occasion I'm running this in DOSBox, which does have a few side effects on the graphics there because I don't really know how to work DOSBox, and there's a bit of aliasing going on there in the graphics, so I apologise for that, but I really did want to show this version of the game because if you look at that and ignore the kind of rounded off edges of the aliasing, it's the Amstrad version. We put them side by side. Those graphics are pixel for pixel, identical to the Amstrad version, all apart from your player sprite, which appears to have some kind of, well, I reckon the colours have been reversed there, and probably not intentionally, possibly some kind of bug with the conversion, because he's got kind of green skin and yellow robes. I'm sure that's not intentional, because every other sprite in this version of the game is actually correct. But as you can see, it's pretty much identical to the Amstrad version here. A little bit slower, but again, that could be DOSBox. You wander around, it's essentially the same game. Pretty similar colours, just ported across. Now, of course, on the IBM PC, you're going to have multiple screen modes, and there's a version for Tandy, which unfortunately I can't run, and the Amstrad colour system, which I can't run either here on DOSBox. However, I can run the CGA version, and it's every bit as ugly as you'd expect. There's no kind of finesse of the Spectrum's colour scheme here. This is kind of very just kind of converted down from EGA, and it's very messy, looks very ugly. One thing I have noted about the PC version is that, again, Leonaric's AI isn't that good. He'll happily wander back and forth between two areas, get stuck there, and not go anywhere, which is a shame because in the Spectrum and Amstrad version, certainly you get a real sense of him wandering around the playing area, working against you. And unfortunately, that's slightly lost on this version because it's painfully obvious that when he's on screen, he's just kind of aimlessly wandering around and he's only getting up to the bad stuff when he's off screen, which is a real shame, really. As I say, it's quite unusual for a game in this area to be spread over so many formats, and there's such variation between the formats. There's also an MSX version, which basically looks like the Spectrum version but has the Amstrad version's sound effects, and I played it under emulation. It plays pretty well. The ST version is pretty much identical to the Amiga version. Nothing to write home about there. If you're going to play a version of this game, I strongly suggest really you play the Spectrum version or the Amstrad version. The Spectrum version plays excellently, doesn't have that level of presentation though that the Amstrad version has. The Amstrad's really polished, really good game. I've played about an hour and a half of it for this review and I don't get tired of it. It's a really good conversion. The other versions are really kind of, they're all lacking something. The Commodore 64 version could be great, but it's not because of that enemy AI, and it's just completely unfinished and shoddy, which is such a shame. The XR version's slow and it has that kind of Leonaric thing where he kills you when he touches you. The Amiga and ST versions just feel a little bit empty because they're just missing a few things. So if you're going to play this game, play it on the Spectrum or Amstrad, because really, really good game on those formats. Really can't fault it.